Welcome to Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corumbus. Our guest in this edition is Captain Paul Austin, U.S. Navy veteran of the Vietnam War. And Mr. Austin, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Where were you born and raised, sir?
Providence, Rhode Island. We moved to Connecticut and then Maine, so it's mostly just New England.
Did you have an interest in flying at a young age, or did that come?
Not at all. Never even thought about it.
When and why did you join the service?
Well, when I was in college, I was studying engineering. And in my junior year, I decided I really didn't want to be an engineer, but I was already committed. And back in the day, you couldn't switch that easily. So I decided to finish, but I was in town and I saw a sign that said Fly Navy and report to Willow Grove the next day for testing. And I showed up and ended up getting in, and a year and a half later I had a deferred show-up time, and in July of '59 I showed up in Pensacola, Florida for flight school. The only time I had ever been in any single aircraft in my life was flying commercial air from Portland, Maine to Pensacola, Florida.
So if you didn't have a previous interest in flying, why did that Fly Navy sign strike a chord with you, do you think?
Seemed like something to do. I really didn't think I'd get in. You know, most people think you got to be able to walk on water, you know, to fly off aircraft carriers. So I just kind of did it as a lark, and then I found out I was qualified. So,
tell me about flight school.
Flight school was good. Everything in flight school is competitive, demanding. There's no workarounds. You pass everything or you're out. And I think they do that on purpose to get people who have those kind of personalities that are willing to put the effort in to learn. And I found I had a really strong affinity to flying. My flying was good as a student. I graduated first in my class, and I got assigned where I wanted to and in the airplane I wanted to. So flight school was very, very interesting because every day was a challenge. Why'd you love it so much? Well, the flying was good. It was challenging and fun. It was didn't seem like a job. It just felt like a challenge to every day. So where did you choose to go, and what did you choose to fly? Well, when I finished, I wanted to go to light attack, so they sent me to A4s, which was the light attack that time. I wanted the West Coast, but there wasn't any billets there, so I ended up in Oceana, which is in Virginia Beach, Virginia. And what did you do there? I was assigned eventually to VA 66, an A4 squadron, which actually deployed on Intrepid, USS Intrepid, a month before I finished the final training squadron. So I actually joined the ship when it was deployed. Talk about that deployment and what you did on it. Well, it's a first tour, and new pilots are designated nuggets. That's your status in life until your first deployment is over. We were all able to fly. Everybody that gets out there is what we call a good stick. They can fly the airplane. Very good, actually, or you wouldn't be there. But you have no idea how carriers operate. They are extremely complex, very choreographed, and lots of changes, lots of challenges. So it takes a long time to really get to the point that you are good enough and have enough background now to be flight leaders. And that's what you're trying to do, is to work your way up to the flight leader status. What were some of the biggest challenges for you? Actually, in my first deployment, I didn't think there were a lot of challenges that I couldn't handle. It's incremental, you know, you're learning little by little by little. There were no big change. The hardest thing about any Navy pilot flying off carriers is the night work. Night landings are really challenging, very unforgiving. And you fly at night every other night. So I have 354 night landings in my career. And I joke when I give my presentation on Midway that I remember every one of them usually at midnight in a cold sweat. Talk us through that. Obviously, landing on a carrier is difficult enough in the daytime, but walk us through a nighttime landing and what that requires. Okay, well, actually, landing in daylight is not that difficult at our level. I mean, remember, we are probably the top of the crop of pilots, or you're not going to be there. So landing is kind of just daylight is just another day in the office. But nighttime, it's much more difficult because all of your normal visual cues are gone. You don't have three-dimensional dimension. The ship doesn't look like a ship. It's just lights. Lights have no dimension. They just sit there. There's nothing going past you, underneath you, so you feel like you're stationary, but you're actually moving at 160 miles an hour. So you don't have any sensation of closure until the last 10 seconds, and then you feel like you're closing like a freight train. Everything happens really quickly. The corrections have to be very small, very accurate to be able to land we actually put our tail hook in what we call a 3x4 foot box. Over and over again. At nighttime, the box gets a little bigger.
And how fast are you moving when you have to hit this box?
Well, the airplanes that I flew at, I'll use miles per hour because most people understand that, was about 160-ish miles per hour. And the ship, though, we've ever had 36 miles an hour wind down the deck, so your closure rate is about 130.
That's a pretty small window to drop your hook, but I guess if enough practice, you get used to it.
Yeah, well, that's the object, yeah, to get at that level and stay at that level. That's why we fly so much at night, because if you don't fly for 10 days or so, it's a perishable commodity. You got to relearn to get back up to that speed and that level.
When you first practice landing, do you practice on the ground with the hook and the wire?
Yeah, they in flight school is when you actually make your first day landings. In fact, on the Midway here is one of the airplanes that I did my first landings on, the T-2 Buckeye. But they have a field that's painted to look like a carrier, same markings on it. And they have the landing aid, which we call the lens, there. And you go out and you have 10 flights, daylight, you make 10 passes per flight, so you get 100 practices. And then if the instructor thinks you're ready, then they take you out to a ship. The first one I did was Antietam, right off Pensacola. And you go out and you get 10-day landings and 10 catapult shots. And that's it, you stop there, and then you move on to advanced training. And in advanced training, at the end, you'll do more landings in a more high-performance aircraft. In my case, it was the F-9s. And you'll do only day again, 10 landings. You don't do your night work till you get to what we call the RAG, the Reserve Air Group. By then you've got your wings, and now you're flying the airplane that you're going to fly in the fleet, in that case, in my case, the A4. And you'll do day and your first night landings. And that's an experience.
Tell me about the A4.
That's my favorite aircraft. I have flown the T2, two different versions of the F9, the A4, the A7, the F8, a little bit in the F18. And out of all of those, the A4 was the most fun. It was just an engine and wings, no systems. The gun sight was almost a grease pencil markup on the canopy. So what you got out of it was what the pilot could get out of it. It was very pilot dependent. As time went on, systems started coming in, and the aircraft became less important, and all the computer systems in the airplane is what the weapon system was. So you're spending all your time pushing buttons and radars and scopes and all that stuff, and the airplane become just a vehicle to get all that stuff there. But the A4 is really, really fun.
And were you able to request that throughout your career?
No, it was phased out eventually, and my second airplane was the A7. That replaced the A4.
Okay. Now that first deployment was a peacetime deployment, correct?
Yeah.
And so you're mainly working on your craft, or were there specific spots in the world you went to
My first deployment was in the Mediterranean. In those days, we were part of the triad, the nuclear deterrence thing, Cold War. So we just operated, trained, stuff like that. We were prepared should something happen, but mostly it was just training and a lot of liberty.
Some fun cities in the Mediterranean.
Well, in the Mediterranean, you would come in through the Straits of Gibraltar, and you would start a clockwise cruise, hitting ports all along the way. And you'd be basically at sea for 10 days and in port for 7. You couldn't be in longer than that, because if we did, we'd lose our qualifications and we'd have to requalify to fly. And that meant we were in port a lot, which meant it cost money. And in those days, I was making $300, $310 a month. Not much, even by that standards back there.
So you had to budget a little bit.
Oh, yeah.
So then after that deployment, what happened next?
We actually returned to Norfolk, and at that point, USS Enterprise, the first nuclear carrier, was working up, and it was ready to go. See, normally when you return, you have what they call a stand-down period, where you lose your people, you get new people, you retrain, get ready for a build-up for your next deployment, and it's usually at least 8 months long, because sometimes you trade out airplanes too, and you get new airplanes. So there's a lot of stuff that goes on. But because Enterprise was ready to go, we only had a 3-month turnaround, and that got short because of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Enterprise was sent down as part of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which we were part of, which is kind of an interesting story if you want me to go into that.
I do, right after this break. We'll be right back with retired U.S. Navy Captain Paul Austin, naval aviator, veteran of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, and nearly 30 years in service to our country. I'm Greg Corumbus. This is Veterans Chronicles. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corumbus. We're speaking this week with retired U.S. Navy Captain Paul Austin, veteran of the Vietnam War and also the Cuban Missile Crisis, which you referenced just before the break. So please tell us your experience with that.
Well, the phase of the Cuban Missile Crisis was we had just returned from a Mediterranean deployment from 6 months. And we were back home, and when you finish a deployment, you have to requalify on a lot of things that you can't do at sea because they don't have the equipment. And one of them is what we call a pressure chamber, where they have a chamber that will take us up to 30,000 feet, and you take off your mask, and it shows what hypoxia is like, and it's a standard annual thing we do. And me and another guy in my squadron went there to get our update, and we noticed in the chamber, they have an altimeter, and we noticed it was going up, 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 which it does, and we got up to around 20 feet, and then we noticed it was going down. And then over the intercom system, they said, Lieutenant Austin and Lieutenant Brest, call your squadron. And when we got down, we called our squadron, and they told us, don't go home, go to the field, your wife is bringing in your bag. And Enterprise was already underway. And we had to fly our aircraft onto the ship. So within 12 hours, we had virtually all the aircraft aboard, and all the other squadrons were doing it too. And we were moving all our equipment aboard through airlifts. It was a real process. But it's interesting to show how the Navy can do those things when they have to. And we got aboard and started down to Cuba. We didn't really know what was going on yet, but the Cuban Missile Crisis was an interesting political thing that we were not quite privy to, but when it was over, it made sense. Because when we got there, we loitered for, I think, just a couple of days, and then they decided we were actually going to launch, and we were going to launch strikes into Cuba. The Air Force was down there on a South Florida base, Key West, I think it was, with hundreds of airplanes. And we had just Enterprise down there, and they cut the island in half. The Air Force was going to take the north end, and we were going to take the south end. And they actually had us playing targets, man up aircraft. We got up on the flight deck, and they said, okay, just stay, you may not go. So we sat in the airplanes. And then about 30 minutes later, they said, okay, start them up. And we started the engines, and we barely got them started, and then they would pass the word, shut them down. So we stopped. We sat there for another 30 or 40 minutes, and they said, okay, pilots can return to your ready room. So we got out of the airplane, went down to our ready rooms. By then it was lunchtime. We went up to lunch, and I remember getting into lunch line, and they passed over the PA system, all pilots man your aircraft. Put down the tray, went back up, and got in the aircraft. And this went on for that whole day. Then at nighttime, we were not going to fly at night on Cuba, so they shut it down. And the next morning, we had the same targets, and they manned us up again to go. And each time they did it, we got closer and closer to a go. On one time, we actually had the first plane on the catapults, ready to launch, when the hold came. And we stopped. And that's how close we came to actually flying combat missions in Cuba. Then when that was over, they were into the fact that the Russians agreed to not do that. So then we just flew training flights in that area to keep the presence of the fleet there to let the Russians know, I guess, we were serious. That's rhetorical on my part, but I'm sure the Kennedy's conversation was, we'll move out when you move out.
What went through your mind when you found out later more of the details that filled in what you were about to do?
Well, it made sense because they were negotiating. We were there to show strength, power. As everybody knows, the Russians only understand power. And they knew Kennedy was serious, good for him. And we were there ready to do whatever they wanted us to do.
And once you got that final hold, did you turn back around, or did you stay there for a
No,
little
we
bit?
stayed there for another week to 10 days, I think it was, just flying in that area, monitoring what was going on, because they were dismantling the missiles that they brought in, taking them out and putting them on ships and all that stuff. So we kind of hung around, I think, until everything was gone, and then we returned to Norfolk. But what that did was it ruined our turnaround time, because we were down there for close to a month altogether. And then Enterprise, of course, was ready to go. And their schedule was only 2 months later, which was 3 months originally from our return. So we ended up going home. We had only a 2-month home port time, and we loaded out on Enterprise and went on what was turned out to be a around the world cruise for Enterprise, because it was nuclear and everybody wanted to show it off, and we were going into every port you could think of, with a lot of dignitaries and VIPs coming aboard to get on the first nuclear aircraft carrier. So it was just a lot of that kind of stuff. We didn't care about the air wing. We just fly airplanes. You know, we didn't know all that stuff was going on. Didn't matter to us.
Captain, let's take one more break. When we come back, much more of your service here on Veterans Chronicles. This is Veterans Chronicles. I'm Greg Corombos. Our guest this week is retired U.S. Navy Captain Paul Austin, veteran of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Vietnam War. And Captain, we just completed our discussion of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and then you were back on the Enterprise again for an around-the-world tour. This is getting fairly close to the start of major U.S. involvement in Vietnam. How soon after that were you directly involved there?
Actually, I didn't get to Vietnam until about halfway through. I got there, I think it was 67 and 68 off USS Kitty Hawk. And my squadron was VA-37, and we were flying A-7s. And I went to that squadron. I was in what we call War College up in Newport, Rhode Island. And I was due to go to sea duty, back to a squadron. And they sent us to a VA-37, which is a brand new squadron. I mean, really brand new. We didn't even have a piece of paper that says VA-37 on it, so we had to start from scratch and stand up the squadron, get all new airplanes. We were the second A-7 squadron, first one on the East Coast to get that airplane. And it took us almost a year and a half to do that, to get ready to go. And then we deployed on a West Coast carrier. We were an East Coast squadron, and we deployed on Kitty Hawk to Vietnam, which was supposed to be a 7-month deployment, which turned out to be 11 months. In fact, we were gone from our home, except for Christmas break, for 13 months. We were in Cecil Field in Jacksonville, Florida. So, you know, we ultimately deployed. It takes almost a month to get from San Diego to the Tonkin Gulf. And you train all the way over. We fly all the time, doesn't matter where we are. And then we got there and we went to Yankee Station, and we were part of the war.
What were your assignments during the war?
Well, we were an attack squadron, still, again, what we call light attack. And they would give us targets mostly in North Vietnam. And they had different kinds. We had what we call alpha strikes, which was major strikes, 37 airplanes on it, to go after what they would call a high-value target, like a bridge or something that was important. And then we'd also go in with just 2 or 4 airplanes. We always had at least 2 or 4. And they'd give us targets, and we'd work our way in through the missiles and what have you, missile sites. And in those days, in North Vietnam, we just did what we call one and done. You can make 1 run, drop your load, and head for the coastline to get out over the water. Go back to the ship, and then you'd probably fly a night flight that night, but that would not be in North Vietnam, that would be in South Vietnam. And it was usually close air support for troops that might be in contact, or FACs. We had forward air controllers that would mark targets for us that they want us to drop on, and then return to the ship. So what we basically flew every day was a day hop, a night hop, then the next day, day only, the next day, day and night. So every other night you were flying at night. So you were flying 3 sorties every 2 days.
What kind of armaments did you have on the A-7?
Well, we were carrying, our standard load was 12, what we call Mark 82s, which are 500-pound bombs. We had 1,200 rounds of 20 millimeter guns. We call them cannons. Then it was actually a Gatling gun, and 2 sidewinders for air-to-air carry. That was kind of our standard load. We would vary it sometimes, but most of the time that's what we would carry.
You mentioned 2 different roles, bombing missions and then also close air support. So let's talk about the bombing missions first. What type of resistance on those missions did you generally find?
Well, in North Vietnam, they were in daylight. We didn't fly much at night in North Vietnam. It was just too dangerous because of the missiles. But in daylight, they would shoot missiles at us, but we knew how to defeat the missile. We actually could outfly the missile and survive. But unfortunately, in doing that, we had to go to a lower altitude to beat it, which then put us invulnerable to AAA guns, anti-aircraft guns. And they were more lethal, actually, than the missiles were. And then you'd have to climb back up again. But we were restricted as to how we could bomb, the rules of engagement. If the Vietnamese knew that, so they would put their high-value targets right next to a town, right next to it. So they knew we could not fly over the town. So if it was near the town, like for example, we could not fly over north or south because a long or short hit would hit the town. So we would have to fly tangential to the town. They knew that. So they would put all their guns on that line and try to shoot us down during those runs. So we learned again to start high, release at the proper altitude, and then turn immediately. One way or the other, didn't matter, just turn and keep turning until you got out of range. But again, in Vietnam, in North Vietnam, we only made 1 run. We dropped all 12 bombs on 1 run and headed for the coast.
How'd you feel about the rules of engagement?
Well, I don't know, how politically you want me to get, but they were terrible. They were really bad. We could have won that war in the first 6 months if we were allowed to do what we could do. But the politics of it, where they didn't want to do those kind of targeting, which would have brought North Vietnam to their knees in 6 months.
Did you have to pass on a number of missions because of their strategic placing of high-value targets?
We always went after our targets. We never, we didn't like it, but that was our job, that was our mission, and we did the mission. We did what we needed to do it. But, that's what we get paid to do.
Then in the close air support, talk about what a typical, if there was a typical mission, what that looked like.
Okay, the close air support was what we considered the most important target. That was #1 priority. And frequently we would be going into North Vietnam, and when you cross the coastline, there's an airplane in the air, either an Air Force AWACS or one of our own aircraft that keeps track of all of us. And when we would cross the coastline, if I were the flight leader in my squadron, our call sign was Red Falcon, and I would say in the blind, nobody in particular, Red Falcon 301 with 2 feet dry, meaning we have crossed, we are now overland. And they would acknowledge it, and we would be heading toward our target. So then we would get, if there were in South Vietnam, if they needed close air support, the air controllers would ask us if we could accept a vector, meaning go where they want us to go, and we would always say yes. There was not a target in North Vietnam that was worth an American soldier in South Vietnam. So we would turn, increase our speed, stay at a combat spread, head down there, and they'd change radios, and we'd get, usually with the forward air controller, and he would, he's talking to the people on the ground, and he would have smokes, and we would tell him what we got, and what our weapons load is, and generally how much time we have on station with our fuel state. And then we would wait, and he would say, okay, and smoke down. He'd fire a rocket with a big puff of smoke on it. And we would acknowledge that we see it. And then he would say, okay, number one, I want your first bomb 50 meters west of the smoke. And I would roll in, put my bomb down, and then he would say, okay, number two, I want your bomb 100 meters north of one's bomb. And they'd work us around like that. So he knew where the bad guys were, and he knew where the good guys were. And he also would tell us which direction he wants us to come into so we don't overfly our people. We always fly tangential so we don't hurt anybody if we get a long or short hit. And we would do that for 12 runs at least. We got 12 bombs and dummy runs. Sometimes we would go in without weapons because they didn't know we were going to drop or not. And it would slow them down. And when we ran out of hard ordnance, the Mark 82s, then we would come down to a lower altitude and strafe with our 20 millimeter cannons. And now you could see the people. You were down there at 500, 600 feet shooting wherever again. He would still direct us, tell us where he wanted them. And we would do that. And when we ran out of the last bullet, we would say we are what we call Winchester, which means we got nothing left. And if we were low on fuel, and to us low on fuel meant we had enough fuel to get back to the ship plus one pass. That was enough for us. As soon as we got to that point, we would use the word bingo. We are 301 bingo means I gotta go. I don't have enough gas to stay around. But it was really not that important because by the time we got there, there were probably 10 other flights waiting overhead. As soon as they say troops in contact, everybody comes. And total support. And then we would head out, when we crossed the beach, we would call those people and say, feet wet, check over our aircraft, see if there's any damage, head back to the ship. They would usually do what they call ready deck, meaning the ship is in the wind waiting for us, and we would come back, enter the break, and land, and go to lunch, and man up and do it again that afternoon.
Now you said a moment ago that you could get low enough to actually see the enemy as you were...
Well, you could see bodies, you could see people moving around, you know, depending. If it was clear area, you could, but most of that Vietnam was jungle. But a lot of places where our troops were what they call fire zones, clear area where they go in and just remove all the vegetation and hold a high point. So you can see, sometimes you could see the Vietnamese, which was really Viet Cong there, trying to move up the hill toward them. But again, you're only 500-600 feet, but you're fast. You're moving at 400 knots.
How intense was the fire against you?
Really very little at close air support, because most of the time what they had was small arms fire. They didn't have AAA or something like that. So it was pretty effective. It would be lucky if they hit an airplane.
How many tours did you do in Vietnam?
2.
And when was the second one?
Actually, it was the end of the war. I actually flew the very last strike of the war. I was on USS Oriskany. I was the Air Wing Operations Officer for, I think it was CAG 11, but don't hold me for that. And they had signed the agreement and in February, I think it was, and I think it was February 23rd, it went into effect. So we were actually flying combat missions for 2 weeks after they agreed to end the war. And we kept thinking, what is going on here? Why are we trying to kill each other when this is over? But they kept sending us targets and we kept going in. So on the very last strike, the Air Wing commander made the statement, there will be no junior officers on that strike. Nobody wanted to write a letter home saying your son or your husband was killed on the last strike of Vietnam. So the entire strike, 20-something airplanes, were all senior officers. And I was one of them. And we went into North Vietnam, dropped our bombs, strafed stuff, got what we call Winchester again, and came back, landed on the ship, and the biggest party you've ever seen in your life broke out on the 03 level.
Now, between your first and your second tour, the opinion of the American people towards the war obviously was souring. Did you experience that personally when you were home?
Oh, sometimes. Well, part of the time before I went to my first one, I was in War College, as I mentioned, in Newport, Rhode Island, and they would have us go to local colleges and conduct seminars for Vietnam. And we thought, geez, we're going to get tarred and feathered by the time we get out of here. But actually, we found that they were not that solid. They were very diversified in their opinion. There were a lot of young kids that would, support, and there were people who were totally against it. So we, for the most part, just started it out. They just went at each other. We just sat there and watched them do it. So. But it was clear. It was clear that there was anti-war. And again, this is just my opinion, having been through it. I don't blame them. It was not proper. It was not done properly, let's put it that way.
So your last mission in Vietnam was in February of 1973. You stayed in the service until 1988. Right. What were some of the most significant points over those final 15 years?
Well, when I finished that, I was what they call screened for command. I became a commanding officer of VA 174. A7s again, only a newer version, the E version, more capable. And that's as every naval aviator knows, that tour is your most enjoyable tour of your whole career, your first squadron command, because it's just fun and challenging, and your attitude is you want to leave the command better than it was when you got there, and everybody tried to do that. And you had 18 pilots, all of which are just aggressive Type A personalities. And it's just fun working with that caliber of person. I could say, okay, I'd like you to do this, and I don't have to think about it again. It will be done, whatever it is. And the other side of it, though, is you got 18 guys that are charging, and they do things sometimes without telling you what it is. You go, well, maybe we don't want to do that, but that's the way they are.
What did you do after you retired?
Really very little. I built 2 houses I live in Coronado. As I said, I studied engineering, and in college I worked at high school and college. I worked as a contractor, a laborer in the construction industry. So I learned a lot about how to build houses. And so at Coronado, they let you do it as your own contractor. So I built 2 houses, one of which we live in now. And then I tried to lower my handicap, and that was a total failure. So no, we traveled a lot, and we just enjoyed life.
Yeah, you've been a docent here at the USS Midway Museum now for 5 or 6 years.
5 or 6 years. I don't remember how many, but I give the presentation on the flight deck of how we land.
What does it mean to you to be part of that and to explain what you did and what so many other service members
Well,
did?
Midway is such a unique venue. I mean, it is a real carrier for practical purposes. We can't get it away, but it's just like it was in real world. The people that come here are very interested in it. We get a lot of comments on it, and I'll give you another story that. When we're giving our presentations, I may have 10 people there or 50. Depends on how many people are bored and stuff like that. And I am microphone, and I got a video behind me, and so I can control the room. And I give a presentation of how we land on the ship. And one time, and it's happened more than one time at this particular time, when I was finished, usually 5 or 6 people come up and shake hands, and they want a picture, and that kind of thing. It's standard. When I was shaking hands with somebody and answering their questions, standing behind them was a very petite, older woman. And she's just standing there, and I thought she had a question. So when people left, I turned to her and I asked her, do you have a question? Can I help you? And just tears built up in her eyes. And like I said, she's about this high. And she comes in and nestles on my chest. And on Midway, we're not supposed to touch anybody. So I'm kind of holding her. And she's just sobbing. And I don't know what to say. So I'm just waiting. And then she backs away from me, and she looks up at her face as she walks away. Never said a word. My point is, we never know who we're talking to. Now, she probably had a son or a husband or some relative that was killed probably in Vietnam. And all that I was talking brought it back. And then I've had people come up, men come up, and Army and Marines, because I do talk about close air sports sometimes, and they'll come up and say, you know, you saved my butt. You meaning rhetorically, you know, a lot of times. Some of them cry.
That's an appreciation that you can't compare. I mean, how do you react to that? I mean, I can see the emotion in your face right now.
Well, it's hard. It's hard. But we go back up to our locker, we call it the Red Room for docents, and I usually would tell people about that experience because all of us, whether I'm giving traps or cats a brief, you know, just talk to people around the ship, and you just don't know what kind of baggage, you know, they're dragging around. And you can say some phrase that just triggers a response. You got to be ready, you know, when that happens. But it's hard to be ready.
Well, I think you may have just answered my last question, but what are you most proud of from your service?
Well, when I was Squadron CO, we deployed on Constellation, had a full deployment, a full workup. We won the Battle E, which is the best squadron for that year. We won a whole bunch of awards, a safety award, etc. But more important, I brought back home the same 18 pilots I took out there.
Retired U.S. Navy Captain Paul Austin, veteran of the Vietnam War and the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm Greg Corombos, and this is Veterans Chronicles.
Hi, this is Greg Corombos, and thanks for listening to Veterans Chronicles, a presentation of the American Veterans Center. For more information, please visit AmericanVeteransCenter.org. You can also follow the American Veterans Center on Facebook, and on Twitter, we're at AVC Update. Subscribe to the American Veterans Center YouTube channel for full oral histories and special features. And of course, please subscribe to the Veterans Chronicles podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and please join us next time for Veterans Chronicles.